Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a fun walk through the mysterious world of medieval myths. So before you get comfortable, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Please tell me in the comments where you are and what time it is where you are. It's always interesting to see who's joining us from around the world. Let's start getting ready for tonight's journey together. First, let's turn off the bright lights and turn on a fan to make it feel more comfortable. If you only know Vikings from the TV shows and movies where there are lots of tall, blonde men with axes, then congratulations. You've already met the berserkers. These warriors were the first to deliberately lose battles in medieval times. According to Norse stories, they would go into a rage during battle and become immune to pain, fear, and being sneaky. For a very long time, historians thought that berserkers were just made up. After all, ancient texts often make things sound more exciting than they really were. Dragons, magic swords, and men turning into were-bears during the fight. All of that is obvious. I think it's probably a metaphor, right? Well, not quite. Lately, new studies and digs have started to link some things together. First, let's talk about fashion. Several Viking graves contain animal skins, especially of bears and wolves, buried with the warriors. Was that just a coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe they liked dressing up before it was popular. But then things got weirder. Now let's talk about mushrooms. We're talking about the kind of mushrooms you might have seen in fairy tales or Mario Kart, with their red and white spots. We're talking about Ammonia muscaria, to be exact. This mushroom is more than just a pretty picture on Pinterest. It has a psychoactive effect. And yes, it grows in some parts of Scandinavia. Eating it doesn't just make you see colors. It can make you feel really happy, disconnected from your body, sweat, shake, and suddenly want to fight your neighbor's goat. Combine that with rhythmic chanting, fasting, and rituals done before a battle, and you've basically got a human tornado that's been enhanced with chemicals and is wielding a battle axe. Imagine going to raid a monastery and being greeted by a shirtless man who is very angry. Modern stories from enemies of the Vikings describe warriors who are immune to injury and fearless. Some experts say that they use shields to control their fits, not for protection. Typical Saturday night activities. The word berserk is still used today, but at the time, it was a scary way of fighting. Try to imagine trying to form a shield wall while a Norseman in a bear pelt runs at you. The plan meets the unexpected. Ah yes, 1518. This was the year when hundreds of people in Strasbourg, France, decided to fight against sadness, hunger, and illness. The only way they knew how, by dancing. They weren't dancing for fun or because they were in love. They were literally dancing until they were bleeding from their feet and their hearts gave out. At the same time, the local authorities were thinking about whether banning music might be better for people than banning witches. At first, it was only a small problem. One woman, Frafa, stepped into the street and started dancing. There is no music and there are no people watching, but there is a good medieval feel to it. After a couple of hours, you would expect someone to throw her a loaf of bread and suggest that she has a nap. Instead, people watched. Then they joined. It seems that in 1518, seeing someone dance was seen as a sign of fun. I'm in. Within days, dozens were dancing, then hundreds, and not at a festival in the middle of the street in the hot summer sun without food, water, or any sense of self-preservation. It would have been a great thing to do on TikTok, except that it caused a lot of people to get hurt. What's confusing is how city leaders have responded. Instead of isolating the dancers or bringing in doctors, they embraced it. They hired musicians, built a stage, and encouraged the dancers to get it out of their system. That's right. The solution to their problem of dancing to death was to make the medieval bass louder. As you can imagine, that didn't work. Historians did not know for a long time if this was real or just another story from a time when leeches were used as medicine and people chose their jobs based on astrology. But lots of records, city accounts, church logs, and personal letters all show the same scary information. People danced without thinking, and some of them died. So what caused it? The most likely explanations are either that the people were poisoned by a type of mold that can cause hallucinations and convulsions, or that they were all influenced by the same thought. It's basically a collective case of madness, triggered by stress, fear, and a lack of hobbies. Whatever it was, it turned one city into a grim disco for a whole month. The moral of the story is this. In medieval Europe, they didn't always burn witches. Sometimes it threw them a dance party. If there's one thing the medieval period was good at, it was making people hopeful, only for things to go wrong. For example, look at the Children's Crusade of 1212. It sounds like a Disney sequel, but it's actually a dark way of commenting on how people make judgments. Here's what happened, as the story goes. A young shepherd boy in France, let's call him Stephen because that was literally his name, claimed he received a message from Jesus. Not just any message, mind you, but one that instructed him to lead a peaceful army of children to the Holy Land, not with swords, but with innocence, which, as it turns out, is not a useful weapon against trained soldiers and sea storms. Lots of children joined in, because why wouldn't you follow a teenage shepherd who said God told him to walk across Europe barefoot? Parents cried. People living in towns clapped and shouted with joy. Bishops blinked slowly and set off across mountains, down rivers, through towns, singing hymns. They were a little hungry, and sometimes they got into trouble with the police. It was a medieval school trip, but without the teachers and with a lot more religious experiences. People used to think that the myth was just a story. This is an exaggeration in monkish writings to teach a moral lesson. Don't send your kids to Jerusalem without an adult to look after them. But over time, historians found more and more documents. Church records, royal decrees, and city archives suggest that something did happen involving young, idealistic people. What happened to them? The result depends on which version you read. It could be anything from very sad to, oh God, why? Some people were turned away at the Alps. Some of them probably died on the way. Others were tricked by dishonest traders, put on ships, and sold into slavery in North Africa. It wasn't the holy liberation they were promised. The Mediterranean wasn't so much divided for them as it was made into an economic opportunity. Today, scholars believe that the movement wasn't just made up of children. Many of these people were probably teenagers or poor peasants. They were labeled as puri, the Latin word for both children and servants. But the mass delusion, the sincerity, the huge misunderstanding, that's real. Picture this. It's a quiet day in 14th century France. A pig runs away, bites a child, and the villagers don't just kill it or blame the nearest peasant. No, they take the pig to court with a lawyer, a judge, and a public trial. Because in medieval Europe, justice wasn't just blind. It was very imaginative. Yes, animals were actually put on trial. Not as a symbol, not as a metaphor, but in reality. They were given lawyers to defend them, and sometimes they were put in prison or kicked out of the church. It's interesting how they used to believe that the devil himself was the one laying the eggs. So, it's funny to think that they would banish a rooster from the church for laying one. For a very long time, people thought these stories were just made up. Medieval scribes were probably just being poetic, making their lists of grain taxes and fish quotas more interesting. But no court records have been found in Europe that show legal proceedings were written out on real parchment paper. One famous case from 1386 involved the essay in Falais, France. She was found guilty of killing a child and was sentenced to death. She was dressed in human clothing, paraded through town, and publicly hanged because symbolism, retribution, general medieval weirdness, and even insects weren't safe. In 1510, a group of French farmers took legal action against a swarm of weevils, claiming that the insects had ruined their crops. The court chose a lawyer to represent the insects. It was probably someone who had annoyed the judge recently. After a few court meetings, the case was closed because, well, the bugs weren't seen. This is typical of a classic defendant. But there's more to it. This wasn't just a crazy idea. In the Middle Ages, people thought that justice applied to the whole world. Animals were still part of God's moral universe, even though they were lower than humans. If they committed a crime or were thought to be working with bad people, they would be punished. The Middle Ages were a time of great commitment. Some of these trials involved the church, meaning it was the church that was in charge. Others were not religious and had full legal proceedings. All of them are now perfect examples of how easily people can give human qualities to things that have legs and a bad attitude. The Iron Maiden is a great example of medieval torture. That well-known human-shaped metal box covered in spikes on the inside, designed to turn heretics into mincemeat. You've probably seen it in museums, horror films, and that one guy's edgy high school sketchbook. There's just one problem. It's a complete fake. Yes, the Iron Maiden is one of the most famous torture devices, even though it was never actually used in the Middle Ages. But it's still shown as if it were the main tool of every angry inquisitor who likes to put on a show. The truth is, medieval torturers were very creative. But this device was invented in the 19th century. Apparently, the Industrial Revolution wasn't scary enough on its own. So where did it come from? The first known Iron Maiden was made in the late 1700s or early 1800s in Germany, probably by someone who thought, you know what? This museum needs a big, spiky lie. The idea was to create a display that would be both exciting and scary, and show what medieval justice might have looked like if everyone back then had watched too many horror films. It was a hit. People love the show because a mix of made-up history and violent imagination always sells well. Even museums got in on the act. You can still find Iron Maidens behind glass with signs that say, actually, this is a Victorian-era replica of something we made up. Medieval people used torture a lot. They used it in new and exciting ways, and they did not have to worry about HR rules and regulations. There were racks, thumb screws, heretics' forks, and something called the pear of anguish, which sounds like a fruit but isn't. But the Iron Maiden is not on the list. They were too busy being horrible in more practical ways. Why did this myth persist? Because it feels true. It fits with the story of a cruel and superstitious time. It's also really scary to look at, which is a perfect example of our shared nightmares about the past. So, a fake torture box became a real symbol of cruelty that was typical of the medieval period. Let's clear up one of the most common misconceptions about the Middle Ages. No, medieval Europeans did not think the earth was flat. They weren't completely ignorant. They had other problems. For example, there were plagues, famines, and unexpected invasions by relatives with swords. But basic planetary geometry wasn't one of them. In fact, most educated people in the Middle Ages knew the earth was a ball. People like monks, scholars, and sailors understood it. Even school books from the 1200s explained that the earth was round, but only if you could memorize Latin conjugations. The idea that the earth is flat was actually invented much later in the 19th century, when historians wanted to make the Renaissance and Enlightenment look better. It's easier to feel superior when you imagine your ancestors navigating with maps that looked like pizza boxes. The real medieval ideas about the universe came from thinkers like Isidore of Seville, Beatus the Venerable, and Thomas Aquinas. These were people with very precise handwriting and extremely strong opinions on religion, philosophy, and the study of the stars. They weren't always right, but they definitely weren't flat earthers. Many people base their understanding on Aristotle and Thomas, who also believed that the earth was round. There were even practical reasons for knowing the earth was round. ships disappearing over the horizon. Round Earth, the curved shadow on the moon during a lunar eclipse. Round Earth, people in Spain couldn't see the same stars as people in Egypt. Once more, around Earth, medieval logic may have been 30% based on divine revelation, 20% based on Latin words, and 50% based on guesswork, but they still got this one right. The confusion mainly comes from a few quotes taken out of context and a lot of wrong information from the 19th century. Washington Irving, yes, the Sleepy Hollow guy, wrote a very popular story about Columbus that made him seem like a really radical guy. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. Imagine being accused of theft in a medieval village. There are no fingerprints or camera footage, and you won't believe what they did. Town crier drama. You, a priest, a crowd of nosy neighbors, and a pot of boiling water. In the Middle Ages, justice was often about trial by ordeal. This was a legal process that relied less on evidence and more on divine intervention and third-party burns. There were several popular orals, all of them designed to make you question your life choices. The accused had to carry a red-hot bar of iron for a few paces. If your hand healed quickly, it was a sign that God was pleased with you. If it didn't, well, sorry, sinner. Boiling water was even more fun. You would put your hand into a pot of boiling water to get a stone out. Once more, it's healing nicely, like an innocent person being healed by the heat from a pizza left under a heat lamp. Guilty. And then there was the ordeal of cold water, which sounds more pleasant, but it wasn't. The accused was tied up and thrown into a river. If they floated, they were guilty because water being pure would reject them. If they sank, they would be innocent but also dead. The system wasn't perfect. Now, people might think this was just cruel and barbaric. And yes, there's a strong argument to be made. But sometimes trial by ordeal worked. It's not because of miracles, but because of psychology. Many people who knew they were guilty refused to go through with it, confessed beforehand, or settled matters another way. The priests often secretly changed the results. Let the cauldron cool for a bit. Use lukewarm water. Judge the healing with some flexibility. They weren't sadists most of the time, just bureaucrats in robes. Eventually, the church banned trial by ordeal in 1215. It seems that someone finally understood that burning people to prove they are innocent is not the best way to act. After that, Europe slowly started to use more rational legal systems. Like jewels, witch hunting, and accusing your neighbor of being friends with frogs. Robin Hood is a character that many people know. He is the outlaw with the green clothes, the sharp arrows, and the strong moral beliefs. He stole from the rich and gave to the poor, and he kept his tunic wrinkle-free while living in a forest. That sounds really good, doesn't it? Well, actually, it sounds almost too good. The Robin Hood we know today is a fictional character. He is a rebel hero who is known for his one-liners and for being able to dodge arrows. But in reality, Robin Hood was actually a real person who lived in medieval times. But here's where it gets interesting. There might have been several people who were Robin Hood. Records from the 13th and 14th centuries mention men with suspiciously hoodish names, such as Robhod, Hobahod, and variations like robbers hoodoos. These men were often listed as criminals or fugitives. By criminals, we mean people who may have avoided paying taxes, taken a deer without permission, or disobeyed a police officer. They didn't rob banks or have socialist meetings in oak trees. But they were outlaws in the literal sense, cast outside the law, surviving on wit boughs, and a deep mistrust of authority. Over time, their stories came together to form a single legend, like a medieval version of fanfiction. If that fanfiction also involved lots of stabbing and plague, the earliest ballads about Robin Hood aren't exactly Disney-friendly either. In the 14th century versions of Robin Hood, he is violent, easily angry, and very fond of murdering monks. Marian doesn't appear until later. In Friar Tuck, He'd sooner throw you in a pond than listen to your sins. But the legend changed over time. By the time of the Tudors, Robin Hood had changed into a friendly criminal who was kind and believed in the modern idea of sharing money more fairly. Because nothing captures the feel of medieval England like the political spin of the 16th century. Was there really a Robin Hood? Probably not just one person. But the conditions that gave rise to the myth were very real. Corrupt officials, hungry peasants and forests just begging to be lit up for the camera. When you hear the word Black Knight, you probably imagine a dark and serious knight wearing old-fashioned armor, sitting in the shadows and talking to himself about getting his own back. He's like a medieval Batman, but with worse teeth. But in real medieval history, the Black Knight wasn't a villain who cackled or a character from a Monty Python sketch. It was a real title, or at least a nickname with some surprisingly respectable roots. The term Black Knight is usually used to describe knights who wore black armor, had a black coat of arms, or were associated with a noble family's dark-colored livery. That's it. There's no magic, no taking souls, and no shouting, "You can't go there." In fact, many Black Knights were just regular nobles trying to coordinate their outfits. One of the most famous was Edward of Woodstock, also known as the Black Prince. He was a prince and a commander in the English army in the 14th century. Some people loved him, others feared him, and he was definitely not the kind of guy who'd sit around in a cursed tower. He probably earned the nickname posthumously for good reason. Maybe because of his black armor, or maybe because of his enthusiasm for burning French towns. Historians are still discussing this, mostly in polite academic discussions. It wasn't until centuries later that the term Black Knight started being used to describe a villain. Romantic literature, 19th century novels, and early Hollywood made the term more popular, or rather, more unpopular. All of a sudden, the Black Knight went from being a mysterious character to being a loner who often appears at tournaments. He's got a shady reputation, and he never wears a shirt. But in the Middle Ages, Black Knights were just part of the colorful feudal fashion scene. They didn't make any dark promises under the moon of blood. They just wanted their armor to match their family banners and to look cool. Some medieval stories sound like they were written after a few too many beers. For example, there's the story of a shining city built in the middle of a swamp by monks. It's like a holy Venice, but with more prayer and fewer gondolas. For hundreds of years, local stories in the English Fenlands talked about Crowland Abbey, a wonderful stone building full of religious feeling, standing proudly on an island of dry land surrounded by deep despair. People say that monks built bridges out of faith, logs, and maybe even divine stubbornness. In the past, experts did not take it seriously and thought it was just an old story. After all, who in their right mind would build a monastery in a swamp? Well, monks would. Recent digs have shown that Crowland Abbey, built in the 8th century and made bigger during the Middle Ages, really did rise out of the mud. It had causeways, raised walkways, and early drainage systems so clever they make modern plumbing look bad. These monks weren't just praying in the mist. They were finding their way through it. They built wooden platforms on piles that went deep into the ground. They used gravel and clay to make the walkways more solid. They also built bridges, including the famous triangular bridge, which is still there today. It's at a three-way symmetry. You can't achieve that kind of architectural ambition by just getting drunk and using a shovel. So why the swamp? There are two reasons. It's about keeping people isolated and offering tax breaks. Monasteries were supposed to be separate from the sinful world. You can't get more alone than this. There are mosquitoes all around you, and pigeons are huge. Also, land that nobody else wanted was often cheaper. So, the monks got creative. They turned the marshes into an important place for religion and business. Farming eels, making cheese, and not getting trench foot every winter. The result is amazing. It shows that even the weirdest sounding medieval stories might have some truth in them. Ah yes, Pope Joan, the mysterious woman who supposedly tricked the entire Catholic Church, rose through the church hierarchy, became pope, and then gave birth in the middle of a papal procession. It's just a normal medieval Tuesday. For hundreds of years, people told stories about her, and church officials tried to stop them. Many modern historians said it was just medieval gossip, a story made up by monks who really didn't want women near the altar. But here's the thing. Some historians have recently looked again at medieval texts, art, and papal timelines. They have raised an eyebrow, but not in a sarcastic way. The earliest detailed versions of Joan's story appear in 13th century chronicles, but there are earlier hints too. For example, the 11th century account by Mariana Scotus lists a pope between Leo IV and Benedict III, a suspicious gap where Pope Joan is said to have ruled. Was this just a coincidence? Or maybe an error made by a medieval priest? Unforgettable. Then there's the strange tradition of the Citia Stercaria, a throne with a hollowed-out seat used during papal enthronements. Some people think it was built to check that the new pope had the right plumbing. Historians say this is just a symbolic tradition, but if your throne has a built-in gender inspection feature, maybe you're protesting too much. Art makes things more complicated. Some medieval tarot decks and church murals show a female pope. Was it Joan, or just the Middle Ages being weird again with symbolism? It's hard to say. Medieval art wasn't exactly subtle. It's the same genre that put dragons next to saints and sometimes drew horses with human feet. So what do we make of Joan? Was he a real person who was erased from history? Or was he a medieval urban legend? Or perhaps a feminist fantasy? The answer may lie somewhere in between. There is no definite proof that she existed, but there is also no official statement from the Pope that says she didn't. There are just a lot of church historians who looked very worried. They were from the 14th century onwards. They seemed to want to change the subject. And if she did exist, she would have the best medieval disguise ever and the worst gender reveal party in history. The story goes like this. The idea that Friday the 13th is unlucky has nothing to do with spilled salt or broken mirrors. It all goes back to the dramatic downfall of the Knights Templar. And, unlike most scary stories, this one is based on real history. It has a sword and a very angry French king. Let's go back to 1307 on October 13th. On a Friday, King Philip IV of France decided he was done being poor and slightly jealous of a secret military religious group that had more land, more money, and, frankly, better capes than he did. Philip ordered the Knights Templar to be arrested in a way that was as subtle as a toddler flipping a board game. Across France, hundreds were arrested, tortured, and accused of crimes ranging from spitting on the cross to worshiping a mysterious bearded head. If you've ever seen medieval relics, you'll know that's not that unusual. The Pope at the time, Clement V, tried to act surprised but eventually gave in. We mean that Philip is breathing heavily down his neck with an army. The church broke up the order in 1312, and the last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake in 1314. Before he was fired, he supposedly swore at the king and the Pope. And guess what? They both died within a year. Was this just a coincidence? Or was it some kind of medieval punishment? Yes, there is a connection between Friday the 13th and the Knights Templar. This idea didn't become popular until centuries later, but the drama is definitely medieval style. The Templars were more than just knights. They were bankers, activists, landowners, and bad news for rulers who weren't religious. Their downfall wasn't caused by heresy. It was caused by debt. King Philip owed them a lot of money, and the best way to pay someone back is to kill them and spread lies about them. When you think of medieval surgery, you probably imagine a bearded man who was probably unshaved and not very clean, cutting off people's arms and legs with a kitchen knife while shouting, "God wills it," over the sounds of patients crying out in Gregorian chants. And to be honest, that happened more than once. But there's more to it. Not all medieval medicine was crazy. Some of it actually worked. No, I'm serious. A recent study of old medical books and archaeological find from the 10th to 14th century shows that medieval surgeons were not as cruel as people thought. They were actually very good at wound care, trepanation, and even cataract surgery, using tools that looked like they were made by a blacksmith with limited resources. Treating someone with trepanation means drilling a hole in their skull. This is done to reduce pressure, cure headaches, or release bad feelings. Why trust Tylenol when you can ventilate your brain? We have proof from archaeology that patients survived these operations quite well. Their skulls showed signs of healing. It's not just a medieval operation. It's more like a last-ditch effort that's actually been carried through. And then there's wound care. Texts like the Trot and Curia Magna contain recipes that would make a modern herbalist very happy. Honey was used as an antiseptic. So was wine, which is a disinfectant, and linen bandages. It's not quite penicillin, but it's better than the usual methods of the time. Even doing dental work wasn't as scary as I thought it would be. Some surgeons use gold wire to hold loose teeth in place. Toothpaste in the Middle Ages was mostly made from charcoal and regret, but they still try to make it. Yes, there were leeches and urine analysis. And yes, if you had a suspicious mole, someone might call a sign of witchcraft and set you on fire. But overall, if you avoided the plague, wore injuries and problems with humor, you had a fighting chance with a fairly good barber surgeon. But this doesn't mean medieval hospitals were like spa resorts. They were more like chaotic monasteries with a prayer budget, a bone saw, and a lot of yelling. But it's not true to say that all medieval medicine was just guesswork. Sometimes medieval doctors were good at their job. Other times they were just taking things as they came, using holy water and thinking positively. But credit where it's due, some of those patients actually walked out with all their limbs still attached. Let's clear up one of the most common misconceptions about medieval times. The idea that everyone from the 5th to the 15th century wandered around like stinky, unwashed potatoes wrapped in wool. Many medieval people were very aware of personal hygiene and were very particular about it. Archaeological digs and old documents suggest that people bathed, groomed themselves, and used scented oils every week. Did they shower twice a day and exfoliate with apricot scrub? Absolutely not. But they did use soaps made from animal fat and ashes. The colors are brown and natural. Many households had wooden tubs. They filled these with hot water for a nice soak. But this was only if you had a servant to carry in, and you didn't live in a shack with lots of drafts. And don't even get me started on the public bathhouses, especially in medieval Paris, London, and Islamic cities where people shared steamy baths. It was a social activity and a way to avoid bad smells. Some had separate rooms for men and women. Sometimes it got a bit too social, which is why some church leaders started to look at the bathhouse industry in a different way. But cleanliness wasn't just about water and soap. People were busy doing all sorts, like trimming their nails, cleaning their ears, and plucking their armpit hair. Monks had very strict rules about how they looked. Nobles wore perfumed gloves and tooth powders made from burnt rosemary and crushed shells. These probably didn't make your teeth white, but they did make them smell nice. So, how did the myth that everyone was dirty and smelled like fermented onion start? It probably comes from a bias towards the later medieval period, especially during the Renaissance and Enlightenment eras. During this time, writers liked to make fun of the Dark Ages to make themselves feel more modern and educated. Add in a few 19th century illustrators who loved the idea of dirty peasants. And there you have it, a stinky medieval meme. To be fair, if you were working on a surf 14 hours a day, you probably didn't end the day smelling like lavender and feeling ambitious. But it was wrong to think that nobody in the Middle Ages knew how to wash their armpits. So yes, medieval people bathed. It's not every day, and I don't always do it on my own, but I still wash. No, this isn't a deleted Monty Python sketch. In some parts of medieval Europe, people accused of crimes were put through a trial called the trial by consecrated bread, or the ordeal of the morsel. If you like baking, here's how it worked. If someone was accused of a crime, usually a member of the clergy, they would be taken to a group of serious monks, probably half asleep. Then they would be given a small piece of special bread. Yes, God blessed the bread and asked to eat it. Sounds simple, right? It's like eating steak. The twist: if the accused seemed to have a tight throat or looked nervous while eating the bread, that would be proof. I'm guilty. You're not the only one who seems suspicious. I'm guilty. We're talking about God himself is now involved, and he clearly thinks you're dishonest. I'm guilty. This method was based on the belief that God would stop a liar from swallowing the body of Christ. It seems that justice from the stars went straight to your throat. It was like a medieval lie detector test, but instead of wires and sweat glands, you got carbs and judgmental monks. And you thought job interviews were stressful. What's surprising is that this wasn't just a few people doing this. These orals were allowed by the church for hundreds of years, especially in Anglo-Saxon England. People thought that God would show them the truth if the law didn't. And because nothing says fair trial like giving a dry cracker to a man who is terrified and hoping he doesn't have acid reflux. In the end, even the church realized this was getting a bit silly. In the early 13th century, Pope Innocent III, who sounds like he should have been innocent, but really wasn't, banned clergy from taking part in trials at all. This meant that the whole operation had to stop. There are no monks and no magic bread. But this actually happened. It wasn't a metaphor. It wasn't a joke. It was full of bureaucracy. The start of a new Templar's journey was not a big public event. It started in the early hours of the morning, when the world was still asleep. A candidate, usually a young knight of noble birth, would approach the gates of a Templar precept, a fortress monastery that was also a barracks and a holy sanctuary. He arrived without any fuss, with no one to greet him or any weapons. His custom was to come humbly, leaving behind everything that made him who he was before. His sword, shield, armor, and even his family's name would be no good to him inside those walls. Joining the order meant giving up all worldly things. The guard led him into a courtyard lit by torches. The air felt thick with a strange mix of excitement and fear. Everyone was made to be quiet. He wasn't allowed to speak until someone spoke to him. Brothers of the temple guided him into the chapel, the heart of the ritual. Templar chapels were usually plain and simple, unlike the grand cathedrals of Christendom. Flickering lamps cast long shadows across stone walls. Relics, splinters of the true cross, bones of saints, and holy icons were arranged on the altar. The setting was designed to make the initiate feel that he was entering a world where spiritual beliefs were more important than worldly things. The brothers stood in a line, their white coats covered in blood-red crosses. The candidate stood alone in front of them, looking like a single person under their watchful eyes. Every movement was deliberate, every moment planned to remind him that he was no longer just one person, but part of a bigger divine purpose. Even the air felt heavy, as if there was a question no one was saying. Was he really ready to give up everything? The light of day started to come through the thin gaps in the chapel walls, lighting up the altar as the person was taken to it. His journey had begun not with a battle, but with surrender. Before him was not an enemy, but an order that demanded absolute devotion. He was not there to show how strong he was with the sword, but to show that he was humble in front of God and that he would obey his master. This was the moment when he left his old life behind and started a new one as a secret member of the Knights Templar. The candidate's first real test was not with a sword or shield, but with his own heart. After being brought into the chapel, he stood in front of the master of the temple, who was in charge of the ritual like a judge and a father. The brothers stood together and didn't say anything, looking at the man who was about to give up his old life. The questioning began formally. The master would ask the candidate whether he had come of his own free will, without being forced or tricked. This was not just empty words. The Templars wanted to be sure. A man who joined unwillingly could not be trusted. A man who wanted the order just for himself was even worse than useless. He was asked, "Do you want to be a part of the group of poor soldiers of Christ and serve God for the rest of your life?" The questions became more direct, trying to find out the truth. Did he owe money to anyone? Was he married, or did he make promises to women or lords? Did he have any commitments that would make it difficult to keep his new promises? If you hesitate to answer, it could mean that they're not interested. The Templars wanted men who were loyal to no one, because a man who was loyal to more than one person could not fight with all his heart. Then came the questions that tested courage. The master told him that life would be difficult. You will not have an easy life, you will not be rich, and you will not have any luxury. You will be called to hunger, to hardship, and to death in the service of Christ. The candidate was reminded that he would wear a simple robe, eat plain food, and give up any personal belongings. He would obey commands without hesitation, even unto death. This was not a romantic gesture. It was very strict, almost like the rules in a monastery. If the candidate hesitated, this was the moment to turn back. Many people did. The ritual allowed a man to leave before making the promise, so neither he nor the order would have to face regret later. But if he refused, the master hit him again. "Do you still want to stay?" A clear answer showed the difference between a visitor and a friend who would fight by your side. The questions weren't meant to be embarrassing, but to improve. It made him see things as they really were and forced him to deal with the consequences of his actions. The ritual only moved forward when the master and the brothers were happy with his answers. He was now ready to commit himself, not just to an army, but to a holy cause that he was completely devoted to. After the candidate had shown how determined he was by asking questions, the most important part of the ritual started, the taking of vows. The Knights Templar were different from other knights because they did not focus on status or money. The initiate was asked to give up not only the pleasures of this world, but also his sense of independence. The first vow was to be poor. He said that he would not own anything himself. Any money, land, or other assets he owned would be given to the order. From that moment, everything he owned, including his bed, cloak, sword, and even the bread he ate, belonged to Christ through the temple. Poverty was not a symbol. It was perfect. A Templar knight might have had dozens of servants, but now he would sleep on straw and share small meals with his brothers. The second vow was to remain chaste. In this part of the world, the person applying for a job promised to give up their life as a woman, marriage, and all the things that come with being part of a family. For many knights, this was the hardest promise. To forsake heirs meant to cut off the dynastic legacy, which was very important to noble families. But the Templars asked for it straight away. The initiate promised to love no woman in a physical way, instead dedicating all their passion to Christ and the Virgin Mary. This was one of the reasons why people later suspected the order's rituals. In a society where marriage defined a person's role, men who cut themselves off from women were seen as unnatural, perhaps even dangerous. The third vow was to obey. If poverty meant giving up things you own, and chastity meant giving up sexual desire, then obedience meant giving up your own free will. The candidate promised to always follow the orders of their master and superiors, no matter what the situation. This vow tied the knight to his duties more tightly than chains. He didn't have any more free will. If he was ordered to go into battle, where he would almost certainly be killed, he would still go. If he was ordered to wait in silence for years while guarding a remote outpost, he would do it. When you put these promises together, they took away the three things that were most important in medieval knighthood: money, family, and being free. But the order offered something better. They were part of a group that said they served God, not a human ruler. This meant that the candidate was no longer just a warrior, but had become a Templar. After the vows were said, the ritual became a physical act of devotion. They kissed holy relics. This was more than just a kind act. It was a sign that the candidates had promised to do what they said they would do. The altar was prepared with the most sacred items the order had, such as a piece of the true cross, bones of saints, or a gospel manuscript. People believed that these relics had divine power, and that touching or kissing them would invite God to witness the promise. The candidate, who was kneeling, was guided forward by two senior brothers. He lowered his head in submission, not to his master or fellow worshippers, but to the sacred objects that represented heaven's authority. The first kiss was often upon the cross, which symbolized the couple's union with Christ's suffering. This was to remind him that the knight's life would be full of sacrifice, hard work, and helping others, which was similar to the sacrifice made on Calvary. Next came the relics of saints, men and women who had lived holy lives of endurance and faith. By pressing his lips to their remains, the initiate connected with their legacy. It was a moment of passing the responsibility of the dead to the living. Refusing the kiss would have been unthinkable, but the act was more than just a symbol. In medieval times, people thought that kissing a relic was like making a special agreement with the saint. Breaking that promise would put your soul in danger forever. The ritual was full of silence. The brothers, who had gathered there, stood still. They were wearing white mantles, and the soft sound of lips against relics could be heard in the chapel. The candidate knew that every kiss was not just a one-time thing, but a promise to stick with someone. From that moment, he would be ashamed of what he had done in front of other people, and he would be judged by God. This made people believe in more myths about it later. People outside the group said that the Templars kissed religious objects in secret, or even that they kissed objects that were against their religion. Rumors like this spread in later centuries and caused problems for the order. But actually, this moment was very traditional. It was a special sealing of vows that was similar to the practices found in churches during the medieval period. When the final relic was kissed, the initiate was no longer just a candidate. He was bound by promises and oaths, tied to a chain of faith that stretched back to saints, apostles, and Christ himself. The vows and relics had connected the candidate to a spiritual level. But the order said that he had to show that he was sorry before they would welcome him fully. At this moment, he knelt before the master of the temple. This changed him from a knight who served the world to a servant of Christ's army. In medieval times, kneeling was a way of showing that you were a servant of the Lord. But with the Templar, the meaning was even deeper. The candidate knelt not to a man, but to the discipline and divine mission embodied by the master. The ritual was simple, but meaningful. The candidate knelt down, head down, hands together, as if in prayer. This was not an accident. It was like when a vassal promised to be loyal to a feudal lord, but without any of the good things that came with that service. Here there would be no lands, no castles, and no riches promised in return. Instead, the knight was choosing to live a simple life, never to have sex, to obey all the rules, and to be ready to go on holy war at any time. The master put his hands on the candidates, making the act official. Then came the words of command, reminding the initiate that from this moment forward, they must obey without hesitation. Whether he was ordered to ride into battle, guard a lonely fortress in the desert, or spend years in prayer and fasting, he always did his duty. Obedience was not something you could negotiate. It was perfect, but there was also comfort in this kneeling. Despite how strict it was, the order was like a brotherhood. The candidate was no longer alone, but was part of a group of people who would look out for each other. By kneeling, he showed that he was ready to be guided, disciplined, and protected by his brothers, just as he was now ready to serve them. People outside the chapel might have seen only a knight kneeling before another man, but for the members of the order, this act had a special meaning. Kneeling was a way of forgetting about yourself, being humble, and starting again to follow God's plan. It was the event that made the knight into a Templar. When a master lifted him up, he was no longer a servant. He was a humble man, but he was also strong and determined. After kneeling before the master, the initiate was not yet complete. The ritual reached its communal stage, with him being accepted by the group. If the vows had made him a follower of God, and kneeling had made him obedient, this next step made him a part of the order itself. The knights, who had gathered to witness the ceremony, were now his new guarantors. They were not just sitting there and watching. They were important. In the dim light of the chapel, their white robes with a red cross made a striking image, reminding the candidate of the purity required and the blood he might one day spill. Each brother had been asked the same questions, made the same promises, and done the same things. If you were admitted into their company, it was more than just joining an army. It was to become part of a spiritual family. At this point, the master would turn to the group and ask if any brother had a reason to disagree with a new person joining. It was a dramatic moment full of tension. If someone knew of a secret sin, an unresolved oath, or a dishonorable act from the candidate's past, he was bound to speak. If you didn't say anything, it meant you agreed. This meant that the man was accepted as pure enough to enter the temple. The weight of everyone's approval was huge. The master and the whole brotherhood accepted this. When no one said they didn't agree, the master said the candidate was a Templar. When he said this, the atmosphere changed. The brothers, who had been unfriendly, suddenly became friendly towards him. Some rituals include the kiss of peace, where each night the new brother is greeted with a kiss on the cheek to show that they are like kindred spirits. Others say that a symbolic embrace is used to welcome new members into the group. This moment of acceptance was very important. The knight was no longer alone, no longer a wandering warrior with only his sword for company. He had gained hundreds of brothers who would fight, pray, eat, and even die beside him. But the secrecy surrounding these rites, especially the kiss of peace, led to rumors later that the Templars had strange, even heretical practices. People outside the group thought that they were making sinister promises and doing blasphemous things, but for the brothers, it was simply a sacred confirmation of their belonging. It was a visible sign that the new member had moved from being alone to being part of the temple forever. The initiation ended with a transformation. This simple but powerful change became the most important symbol of a Knights Templar, the investiture with the white mantle. For a medieval knight, clothing was more than just fabric. It showed a person's status, money, and loyalty. If you take off one piece of clothing and put on another, you're leaving behind your old self and taking on a new one. The candidate, who was still kneeling, was taken back to the altar. A senior brother stepped forward, carrying the mantle, a plain white cloak marked with a red cross. Its simplicity was very different to the rich tunics and colorful coats of arms that most knights wore. While other warriors wore family crests and gold embroidery, the Templar mantle was a sign of humility, purity, and absolute devotion. The red cross stitched over the heart was not just for decoration. It was a reminder. They might demand blood, and sacrifice was unavoidable. The master spoke as the garment was placed on the initiate's shoulders. He explained that the whiteness symbolized purity and spiritual cleanliness, while the cross was both a burden and a blessing. When he wore the mantle, he was saying that he had given up the world. Wherever he traveled, from Paris to Jerusalem, from dusty roads to royal courts, his cloak showed that he was a Templar, a member of a special group of fighters. This investiture was often followed by a warning. The master would tell the new knight that if he ever betrayed his vows, the mantle would become a curse. To disgrace the cross was to invite eternal damnation. The garment was more than just clothing. It was a symbol of spiritual marriage to the order. It was not something you could just wear casually. Everyone in the chapel would become very quiet as the initiate got up. They were now wearing white and red. For the first time, he stood as a knight of the Templar Order. The assembled brethren saw not a candidate, but a brother dressed in the same colors that they themselves wore. That moment made him feel proud and scared. The new knight had joined one of the most powerful groups in Christendom, and everyone was proud. From this day forward, he would live his life in constant fear, facing danger at every turn, and feeling the weight of the red cross on his shoulders with every step, every battle, and every prayer. The mantle was a mix of glory and burden. No initiation was complete without a meal, not a fancy one, but a meal shared at a table where the new knight joined his brothers for the first time. In medieval society, eating together was about more than just getting food. It was a way of showing that they were related. For the Templars, who lived by strict rules, the meal they shared was very important. The meal was simple, as was the rest of the event, to show that they didn't want to waste money. There were no fancy glasses, no over-the-top food with lots of spices, and no musicians to make music. Instead, the knights sat together at long wooden tables. They ate plain food like bread, broth, beans, and maybe roasted meat if they could get it. Each portion was measured, and no one was allowed to overeat. After the earlier ceremony, there was silence, but then people started praying quietly and talking to each other. You could also hear the sound of spoons being dropped into bowls. For the new member, this was the first test of whether they belonged. He was no longer an outsider, but a brother at their table. By eating the same food, drinking the same wine, and following the same rules, he became a full member of the Templar Order. Here there were no noblemen or peasants, no lords or commoners, only brothers bound by vows. The table's equality was one of the order's best features. The master or senior officers often used this moment to remind the newcomer of the rules that govern meals. They didn't talk about much, and when they did, it was usually about religion, discipline, or how to run the campaign. Excess was not allowed. Even acting greedy, like grabbing food too quickly, could get you in trouble. The meal itself was a continuation of the vows. The act of eating showed simplicity, obedience, and humility. This banquet also had a spiritual side. Eating together was a way of remembering the last meal that Jesus and his followers had together and the close friendship they shared. Just as the knights had sworn oaths before relics, they now confirmed their unity by sharing food. The initiate, tasting the plain bread and wine, knew he was bound to these men not just in battle, but in daily life, in hunger, and in prayer. By the time the meal finished, the new knight had completely crossed the threshold. He had been questioned, tested, and sworn to tell the truth, and now he was eating the same food as his brothers. What remained was the final blessing, the sealing of his place in the spiritual army of the temple. The final part of the initiation was both serious and inspiring. The final blessing that made the knight part of the brotherhood forever. Everything that had happened before, like the questions, the promises, the kneeling, the relics, the cloak, and the meal, led to this final act. The new member of the Templar Order was officially welcomed into the group at a special ceremony. The chapel was silent again. The master stood before the new knight, lifting his hands in blessing. People said prayers to Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints to witness the vows that had just been made. This blessing was not just a symbol. It was a promise that had to be kept. People thought that the initiate was marked with a spiritual sign, making them different from other Christians. He was no longer a free knight of the world. He was now a soldier of Christ, and he promised to defend the faith until he died. Some people say that the blessing also had a warning. The master told the new brother that breaking his vows was a betrayal of the order and God. If people did not follow the rules, they would be punished in this life and the next. It was a serious reminder that this brotherhood was not something to be entered lightly. Once they were tied up, there was no escape, only life as servants or death in disgrace. After the blessing, the brothers together sang prayers in Latin. The effect was overwhelming, the sound of voices echoing against stone walls, a wave of devotion that swept him into the rhythm of the order. For the initiate, it was a goodbye to the life they had left behind and a welcome to something eternal. Finally, the master said he was a brother of the temple. A quiet approval could be heard among the group. The knights came closer, offering to kiss or shake hands, small gestures that meant a lot. With these, he was no longer an outsider, but one of them, ready to fight, pray, and die alongside them. When he left the chapel dressed in white and carrying the red cross, the world would see only a knight. But within the order, he was something greater. A man changed, dedicated his life to God, and promised to be loyal, ready to sacrifice himself for others and to have faith. He didn't have any more free will. It belonged to the temple and to God. In the busy streets of Pompeii, where merchants called out their wares and carts rattled over stone roads, there stood a building that was very different from all the others. This was the Lupanar, the city's most famous brothel. To the casual visitor, Pompeii might appear as a model Roman town with its forum, temples, and public baths. But sex was also a normal part of daily life. It was not hidden or whispered about, but openly traded like bread or wine. The Lupanar was the most important part of this trade. It was a very important part of the economy of Pompeii, just like the markets there. The name Lupanar tells us what the Romans thought it was used for. It comes from the Latin word lupa, which means she-wolf, and was used as a slang word for prostitute. Just as a wolf looks for prey in the wilderness, these women were imagined as looking for customers. But actually, it was the customers who walked around the city looking for carved phallic symbols, which literally pointed the way to the brothel's doors. These symbols were etched into paving stones and walls. For a Roman man, whether he was a soldier, sailor, or merchant, there was little secrecy in such activities. Pompeii wore its sexuality openly, and the Lupanar made no attempt to hide its purpose. The building looked normal from the outside, and it matched the other stone buildings around it. But step through its narrow entrance, and you enter a different world. The air smelt of oil lamps, cheap wine, and bodies pressed into small, stifling rooms. The voices of clients bargaining, the laughter of women trained to seduce, and the graffiti of past visitors all showed that this was a place that had been used for a long time. It was a place where Roman men would often go during the day. Unlike temples, which promised divine ecstasy, or taverns, which promised escape and drink, the Lupanar promised immediate physical satisfaction. It was a place of intense desire, where the action was constant. Some came in groups, others alone, but all found the same direct efficiency. The beds were made of stone, the mattresses of straw, and the walls were painted. These signs showed what could be bought. Going into the Lupanar was like entering Roman life. In this small, dimly lit building, you could see the unpolished mix of money, desire, and social rules. This was the side of Pompeii that the ash from Vesuvius would keep forever. The Lupanar looked like any other stone building in Pompeii, blending in with other buildings like taverns, shops, and homes. But once inside, its design was all about one thing: making the most of what people wanted. Unlike the opulent Roman villas with their mosaics and atriums that open up to the sky, this brothel was built with narrow corridors, cramped chambers, and a dark intimacy that left little room for lingering. The building itself had 2 floors. On the ground floor, there were 5 small rooms, each with a stone bed built in. These were just cubicles. They had no windows, no air conditioning, and hardly any furniture. A thin mattress stuffed with straw or cloth was placed on the stone platform, and often a rough blanket was used to cover it. The idea wasn't to make it comfortable. Durability was. The stone made sure that the beds could be used all the time without breaking, and straw could be easily replaced when it got dirty. This was enough for the typical man from Pompeii. Sex was just a transaction, not a romance. A staircase led to the 2nd floor, where the atmosphere was slightly different. The rooms upstairs were bigger, lighter, and often used by wealthier guests. Visitors might find wooden beds, softer bedding, or a lack of privacy downstairs. People who had more money wanted more than just pleasure. They also wanted comfort, and you can see this in the architecture. At the center of the brothel was a small stone staircase. This was the main way that the upstairs and downstairs areas were connected. It was used for brief encounters and longer sexual activities. The walls helped to guide customers. The carvings on the walls pointed towards the rooms, almost like arrows, to help even strangers find their way around. The brothel was practical, but it also had a symbolic meaning. The small rooms on the ground floor showed the true and censored side of Roman sexuality. It was quick, casual, and available to everyone. The upper rooms showed how Roman society was divided into different classes. Even if you were rich, you could still enjoy luxury and indulge in lust. Together, they formed a small world of Pompeian life, with all its different classes, money issues, and human desires all crammed into one place. Walking through its halls felt like stepping into a machine built for one purpose. Every part of the Lupanar, from the sound of footsteps on stone floors to the flicker of oil lamps against painted walls, reminded the visitor that this was not a home or a temple, but a marketplace of flesh. The most striking feature of the Lupanar is the erotic frescoes painted above the doors of its small rooms. These frescoes have fascinated both historians and tourists. These images were not just decorations or hidden messages. They were explicit pictures of sexual acts that had been preserved very well under the ash of Mount Vesuvius. When you walked into the brothel, you were confronted by a display of women, like a menu with pictures of the girls. This helped the client choose. In a city where not many people could read, especially slaves, foreigners, and poor people, these paintings were useful. Even if a traveler didn't speak Latin or a client couldn't read, they could still point to the image that matched what they liked. Each fresco showed couples in different positions or situations, leaving little room for modesty or ambiguity. The Romans did not hide their sexuality in less direct language. They showed it as simply and straightforwardly as a baker would show loaves of bread. The frescoes were placed in a specific way that also had a symbolic meaning. They were put above each room's doorway, almost like signboards in a shop. Some scholars think they were like adverts for what might be inside, while others believe they were just general pictures meant to get people excited. Either way, the effect was clear. The walls became like salesmen, guiding the viewer's eye and imagination. The artistry was crude by the standards of Roman villas, which often had fancy frescoes of myths. But the images from Lupanar were not very detailed, but they were easy to understand. The strong lines, big bodies, and bold poses clearly showed what was available. And unlike the subtle eroticism found in elite homes, these frescoes were very obvious. Their job was to make it easier for businesses to do their work. It's interesting that these menus might also have had a regulatory role. By showing a variety of acts, the brothel made clear what was expected of both client and prostitute. This made it much less likely that customers would argue about the prices, just like a pub putting up a sign with the prices of its wines. For archaeologists, the fresco is more than just a source of fun. They give us a rare look at the sexual economy of Pompeii, showing not only what people did, but also how they thought about sex in a society where desire was seen as something to be bought and sold. They remind us that the Lupanar was not a hidden den of shame, but an openly advertised marketplace of pleasure, where walls spoke louder than words. Behind the painted walls and stone beds of the Lupanar were the women themselves, the main people involved in the sex trade in Pompeii. Their lives were difficult, they worked very hard, and they were often treated unfairly. The prostitutes of Pompeii were different from the prostitutes of later European history. In Pompeii, most prostitutes were not women who had chosen to be prostitutes. Most of them were slaves. They were bought or captured from distant provinces and brought into the city as commodities. They were traded just like grain, wine, or olive oil. The Lupanar's women came from across the Roman Empire, Gaul, Greece, Syria, and North Africa. They were sometimes advertised as exotic attractions, appealing to clients who wanted something new. These women often had their names changed. They were given simple Roman names like Fortunata, Lucky One, or Prima the First. This made them seem like objects listed like items in a market stall. Their daily lives were very hard. They worked in very small rooms that were very hot and had no air for morning until late at night, often looking after several customers one after the other. Payment was collected quickly, usually in the form of a single coin or sometimes the equivalent of a loaf of bread. The women didn't keep much for themselves. The brothel's owner claimed the earnings. Even their bodies were not truly their own because they had to obey strangers and the rules of the establishment. But even in this difficult situation, there's still signs of who they are. Graffiti scratched onto the walls of the Lupanar Preserve contained bits of the women's voices, boasts, names, and even friendly comments left for future clients to read. Some of the writing shows pride and skill, while other letters show bitterness at being taken advantage of. These fragments remind us that the women were not just objects, but people with their own thoughts, frustrations, and strengths. They were seen in a very negative way. Roman society accepted prostitution, but did not respect it. Prostitutes were legally considered to be in a group of people called infames. This meant that they had many of their rights taken away. They were not allowed to marry respectable citizens, inherit property, or take part in civic life. The brothel made them visible but not respected. But these women were very important to the economy and society of Pompeii. They provided a service that men of all classes asked for, from slaves to senators. We don't know their names, but the ash of Vuvius has kept the traces of their work, their voices, and how they got on inside the small rooms of the Lupanar. If the women of the Lupanar were the workers, the clients were the reason the business existed. To understand Pompeii's brothel, you need to know about the men who used to visit it. People thought that only poor or desperate people went to buy sex, but the Lupanar's customers were from all levels of Roman society. Everyone passed through its narrow doorway, from slaves with a single coin in hand to merchants fresh from trading voyages, from soldiers to local elites seeking to remain anonymous. The fact that services were affordable meant that almost anyone could go to a brothel. A visit could cost as little as a single lei, which is about the price of a loaf of bread. This meant that even the lowest worker could buy a moment of pleasure. The upstairs rooms were nicer and had better beds. They also made the guests feel like they were getting something special. But the act itself didn't change. It's quick, simple, and without any romance. Graffiti on the wall shows that there were clients there and gives us an idea of what they are like. Some people even recorded their visits. I had a great time here with Fortunata. Others left rude boasts about how great they were, which made the walls look like a list of big blokes. Some of the inscriptions are like customer reviews, either praising or criticizing the women by name. These writings, which are casual but permanent, show how common it was for men to visit brothels in Pompeian life. For Roman men, there was little shame in visiting a prostitute. Men who were married often went to the lupanar without feeling embarrassed. Women were expected to be faithful, but men weren't. In Roman times, sex with prostitutes was seen as acceptable and practical. It gave women a way to express themselves that kept them safe from men's unwanted attention. This meant that the brothel became a place of pleasure and also an institution that reinforced the double standards of Roman morality. At the same time, the lupanar offered more than just physical release. It was also a place where men could meet and drink, boast, and carve their names into the wood. It was a place where men could drink, have fun, and show off. In a world where how people thought of you was very important, some men thought that leaving a mark on the walls of the brothel was as important as leaving one on the battlefield. The clients of the lupanar were not a hidden subculture. They were the people of Pompeii. They were the traders, soldiers, and citizens who made the city thrive. They did not see anything wrong with working hard and enjoying themselves at the same time. The paintings on the walls were like the official advertisements, while the graffiti was like the unofficial commentary. Few ancient buildings let us see what daily life was like in a way that is as clear as this brothel. The walls were used to express humor, pride, desire, and frustration. Visitors left behind rude boasts about their conquests. One inscription says, "I slept with many girls here." Another, more specific, name is used for the prostitute. "I had a good time with Fortunata for 1 coin." These graffiti blur the line between men just wanting to brag and them being honest about their experiences. Some comments even praise or criticize the women's skills, which makes the lupanar's walls one of the earliest forms of public rating systems. But not all graffiti came from clients. Some of the women wrote their names or short messages on the walls, taking back control of a place where they were otherwise being controlled. These drawings often show feelings of pride, wit, or defiance. One woman carved her name into a heart, showing that even in the toughest conditions, you can never be erased as a person. For archaeologists, these markings are very important because they show that these people were real people who laughed, loved, and suffered. Other graffiti show the different types of people who visited the brothel. Soldiers drew pictures of shields or phallic symbols. Merchants wrote down names, and travelers carved jokes in foreign writing. The brothel became more than just a place of sex. It was also a place where different cultures met and mixed, with people from all walks of life united by their love of food. Some of the inscriptions were also philosophical. One reads, "Weep ye girls, my penis has given you up. Now it pursues men's behinds." It might be a bit crude, but it's also a fun way of expressing who they are in a society that was open to different types of sexual expression. These walls captured it all, showing off, teasing, humor, and even moments of weakness. The lupanar's graffiti is more than just random drawings. They are a record of what life was like for people in Pompeii and include the voices of men and women who did not expect to be remembered after their deaths. The fresco was meant to be eye-catching, but the graffiti was the real deal, the true voice of the street. Today, They remind us that ancient people were not statues or myths, but real humans who left their marks for future generations to find. The Lupanar was more than just a place for fun. It was a business that was very important to the economy of Pompeii. In a city full of merchants, sailors, and travelers, the brothel worked in the same way as a bakery or pub. It was successful because it was easy for people to get to, it wasn't expensive, and there were always lots of customers. And like any successful business, it catered to both ordinary people and rich people. The prices were very low. Inscriptions suggest that a visit could cost as little as one is the price of a loaf of bread. For 1 coin, a soldier or worker could use one of the cubicles on the ground floor. The rooms upstairs, which were for people with more money, cost more. Here, you could buy comfort. Wooden beds instead of stone, softer blankets, perhaps more privacy. But even in these rooms, the meetings were still business-focused and lacked personal connection. The money collected did not stay with the women. Most of the women were slaves, and the money they earned went straight to the brothel owner, who might have been a rich Pompeian citizen running lots of other businesses. In some cases, freed women could work independently, paying a cut of their profits to the manager. But for most people, the Lupanar was just another part of the system of Roman slavery. Their bodies are a product that can be bought and sold, and their work brings in money. The business was quite big. With 10 rooms, lots of customers, and low prices, the brothel could serve dozens of clients every day. If you think about that over a long period of time, the Lupanar becomes not just a building, but a way to make money all the time. For Pompeii's economy, which was already supported by trade and tourism, the sex industry added to the business opportunities, and most people thought this was acceptable. As well as money, the Lupanar also supported other businesses. There were also lots of pubs nearby that sold wine to make people chat more easily and spend more money. People selling food shouted to men who were leaving the brothel. Even the graffiti carved into its walls had an economic angle. Names of prostitutes became brands. People who came back regularly told their friends about the restaurant, and the fresco was like a permanent advert. To put it simply, the Lupanar was a busy business center that looked like a brothel. Its walls reveal a world where sex was not taboo, but a trade where desire was made into money in a brutal way. Pompeii's economy was based on bread, wine, olive oil, and meat. To us today, the openness of the Lupanar seems very surprising. In Roman society, prostitution was seen in a strange way. It was both accepted and looked down on. It was legal, it was taxed, and it was a normal part of city life. But the women who worked there were seen as dishonorable and left out of society. This contradiction is what made the brothel, a place many men used without feeling ashamed, but which was seen as a bad thing for those inside it. For Roman men, visiting a prostitute was not a moral failing. Men could go to the Lupanar without feeling embarrassed, even if they were expecting their wives to be completely faithful to them. A wife's job was to protect her family, and her husband's visits to the brothel were seen as acceptable. Roman law and custom were both based on double standards. The act was not about love, but control. Men were allowed to want sex, but women were strictly told how to act sexually. But the prostitutes were the ones who suffered the most from this stigma. They were stripped of their rights, just like in games. They weren't allowed to marry respectable people, give evidence in court, or inherit money or property. The law said that their bodies were public property. Even women who had become prostitutes by choice were still seen as being dishonorable, and it was very difficult for them to be seen as respectable. If a woman was marked as a prostitute, she was permanently marked no matter how rich she was or how old she was. But society needs them. People who study morality, like Seneca, and philosophers, like Cicero, agreed that prostitution kept society in order by providing a legal way for men to satisfy their desires. Augustus himself was in charge of the trade, and he made prostitutes register with the authorities. So, Rome made what it also hated official, and made prostitution a normal part of life in the city. The stigma even extended to space itself. The Lupanar was in a working-class area near taverns and shops, not in Pompeii's posh districts. Well-respected women would not go there, and noble families would not talk about it in public. But its clients came from all parts of society. The building was both in the middle of things and on the edge of things, which is strange. This tension between tolerance and shame is what makes the Lupanar so revealing. It was not hidden or celebrated, but accepted as an everyday, even useful part of Roman life. The brothel showed the contradictions of Roman ideas about what was right and wrong. The city was a place where people felt they could be both good and bad. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE, it did more than destroy Pompeii. It kept it safe. The Lupanar, like the rest of the city, was covered in layers of ash and mud. This protected Roman life that might otherwise have disappeared. Unlike in Rome, where centuries of rebuilding destroyed much of the past, Pompeii remained frozen in time. This meant that archaeologists could study it as it was in an instant. The Lupanar is very special. The stone beds are still there, in their small cubicles, and they're worn smooth from being used so many times. The erotic frescoes are still bright and clear, and their colors are protected by volcanic ash. The scenes of desire are very direct and shocking for modern viewers. Graffiti lines the walls, just as it did nearly 2,000 years ago. It preserves the casual boasts of clients and the names of women whose lives would otherwise be forgotten. Every scratch, every rough drawing, every boastful word became forever immortal the moment Vesuvius erupted. For historians, the Lupanar is more than just an interesting thing to look at. This shows how openly the Romans integrated sexuality into their urban world. The brothel was not an exception, but a legal, regulated, and accepted institution. Its preservation forces us to confront the reality of Roman life, not through stories or idealized literature, but through the simple, unpolished remains of everyday transactions. The Lupanar also has its problems. It shows a society that has made the human body a product to be bought and sold, while also being sexually free. This meant that men could enjoy themselves without feeling guilty, while women were condemned to live with a lot of stigma. It makes us think about what is right and wrong in a new way, asking difficult questions about power, how people are taken advantage of, and desire in ancient societies. Today, visitors to Pompeii often go to the Lupanar, drawn by curiosity and the promise of scandal. But those narrow stone rooms are more than just sexy old things. They are memorials to lives lived in shadows, women who worked hard but were not recognized, men who wrote their names in a history, and a city that saw no problem in mixing business with desire. The Lupanar is Pompeii's most famous building. It is a place where money, desire, and human weakness meet. It was kept safe by disaster, and it speaks to us from thousands of years ago. It reminds us that even though Rome was successful, its people were still human, with their own strengths and weaknesses. In Sparta, marriage was not about romance, candlelit evenings, or vows. It was first and foremost a duty to the state, an obligation wrapped in ritual, designed to serve the city's constant need for strength. In Sparta, marriages were not based on family ties or managing a household. Instead, the main focus was on having strong children who would grow up to be brave soldiers and strong mothers. The personal wishes of the bride and groom were less important than what the community needed as a whole. The Spartan system was unique in the ancient Greek world. Every part of society, including schools and churches, was focused on making sure that the country had a strong military. Most men spent most of their lives in the AOG, a tough training program that turned them into warriors. Women were expected to be as strong as men and to exercise to have healthy babies. In this system, marriage was not just a private deal between two people, but a responsibility for the whole community. When a couple got married, it was important to think about what this could do for Sparta's future armies. This way of thinking influenced every part of their culture. For Spartans, a wedding was about getting the job done quickly and efficiently. The government got involved and made sure that unions were based on practical things like age, strength, and how many children people had. Even stories about Spartan weddings show this practical attitude. The idea that two people might marry for love or because they like each other was seen as wrong, even dangerous. Love could distract a warrior from his duty, while indulging in luxury was a threat to Sparta's strict way of life. But despite this, Spartan marriages were actually quite equal. Unlike in other Greek city-states, Spartan women weren't just limited to the home. They owned land, managed estates, and spoke openly in public. This meant that their role in marriage was more balanced. They were not as submissive or dependent, but rather partners tasked with maintaining the Spartan bloodline. The traditions surrounding weddings showed this. It is harsh and even brutal, but it also shows how strong we are together. In the end, a Spartan marriage was not two people binding themselves to each other for love, but two citizens binding themselves to Sparta. Their relationship was another tool the city had, created not because they were in love, but because they needed each other. In Sparta, people's marriages were arranged, not chosen by the couple. The state decided when its citizens could get married, making sure that marriage was good for the military and the population. Unlike in other Greek city-states, where men often married young to keep their household stable, Spartans had a very strict pattern. Men usually waited until they were 30 to get married, while women often got married in their late teens or early 20s. This unusual age difference was not an accident. By the age of 30, a Spartan man was considered experienced because he had completed the tough military training system, which started in childhood. He had to prove himself as a disciplined warrior, able to obey and last long, before he was seen as ready to get married. The state demanded that men show they were loyal to Sparta before they could be trusted to be loyal to a household. In other words, marriage was a reward for survival and service. Women had a different logic. Spartan girls were raised to be strong, good at sports, and able to cope with difficult situations. They train in a variety of ways, including running, wrestling, and even javelin throwing. This physical discipline was not to prepare them for battle, but for motherhood. The perfect Spartan bride was someone who could give birth and have strong children. By getting married young, women started their most fertile years under the state's control, which was all part of Sparta's plan to have strong, healthy children. The result was very different. Experienced warriors marry young, strong women. This combination perfectly represented the Spartan idea of balance, with the strength of men combined with the energy of women. The family was not built on love, but on practicality. Both partners were chosen at the best time to help the city survive. But surprisingly, this meant that Spartan women had more influence than women in other places. Because men stayed in barracks until they were 30, even after they got married, their wives often ran the estates and looked after the money when they were not there. This created an unusual situation where women were younger, but not powerless. They were given responsibilities that Athenian women could scarcely imagine. So, in Sparta, the age at which people got married was more about society than about biology. It reflected the beliefs of the people who made it. The state had created a timetable that made sure that marriage was about war, not romance. In the ancient world, few customs were as striking or as unsettling as the Spartan treatment of brides on their wedding night. Unlike the flowing dresses and elaborate hairstyles of Athenian or Corinthian brides, Spartan women were stripped of their femininity before entering marriage. Their heads were shaved clean, their bodies dressed in a man's cloak, and simple sandals replaced any hint of adornment. At this moment, the bride was transformed not into a delicate wife, but into something resembling a young warrior. Why is this a special ritual? The symbolism was twofold. First, it showed that Sparta did not value luxury and vanity. Long hair, jewelry, and perfumes were seen as signs of wealth and softness, which was something that society did not like, as it valued austerity and discipline. In Sparta, the bride's head was shaved as part of the wedding ceremony. This was to show that the union was based on strength and not on how the bride looked. Second, the disguise made it hard to tell the difference between men and women. Spartan marriage was not about a submissive woman joining a dominant man. Instead, the bride's transformation highlighted her role as a partner, someone expected to face challenges and contribute to the Spartan idea of strength. Dressed in men's clothing, she looked tough and equal, showing that she was not fragile. This was a special practice in Greece, where most women stayed at home and were expected to be modest. But there was also a deeper psychological reason for it. For a Spartan groom used to life in military barracks, getting married can be a shock. By presenting the bride in a way that wasn't clearly male or female, the ritual made this change less obvious, connecting the idea of male friendship with the idea of a heterosexual marriage. As time went on, the woman's hair grew back and she settled into her new role as a wife. This complete change was then complete. She had now become as tough as her husband and could produce the next generation of warriors. It might seem strange today, but the way the Spartans shaved was a way of showing how they mixed gender roles with taking care of the city. The bride's body was transformed into a symbol of strength. This was because marriage in Sparta was not about romance or beauty, but about survival, strength, and creating a unified, disciplined household. In most Greek cities, weddings were public celebrations with music, food, and parades. In Sparta, however, the union of husband and wife began with something that looked more like a raid than a ceremony: the ritual abduction of the bride. This was not a romantic gesture. It was a symbol of strength and control, and showed that the woman was now going to be his wife. After the bride had her head shaved and was dressed in male clothing, she was secretly abducted by her groom. The act was not violent like a real kidnapping. Both families knew about the custom, but the symbolism was strong. The groom took her away from her family home to a private room, which marked the moment when she left her old life behind. The ritual had many meanings. First, it was similar to the military culture of Sparta. Just as Spartan men were trained to seize power and endure through force, the abduction dramatized marriage as a conquest, not of love, but of duty. The woman, who had lost her feminine qualities, was taken to a new world where she would be the mother of warriors. Secondly, the abduction made people more secretive and less willing to speak up. Unlike at other Greek weddings, there was no big meal or display for the community. Instead, the first time the bride and groom met was a private and formal occasion. The marriage bond was not meant to be a public spectacle, but a private symbol of strength, reflecting Sparta's disdain for extravagance. Perhaps the most interesting thing about this ritual was the way it was part of the life of a Spartan man. Even after they got married, men still lived in military barracks until they were 30. For years, a husband would often visit his wife only at night, slipping secretly into her bedroom and leaving before sunrise. Some scholars say that this secrecy made people interested because it made it feel new and exciting. Others say it was a symbol of the importance of the military over marriage, reminding people that a man's family was not more important than Sparta's army. For the bride, the abduction marked her transformation. She was no longer her father's daughter, but a Spartan wife. She was bound not only to her husband, but to the city itself. For the groom, it was a way to show who was in charge and to prove that he could control himself. This proves that even in love, he was still following Sparta's rules. In most cultures, marriage meant starting a new family, eating meals together, and living as a married couple. In Sparta, things were very different. Even after their wedding night, the husband did not move in with his bride. Instead, he went back to the military barracks where Spartan men had to live until they were 30. This meant that marriage began with separation rather than togetherness. The bride stayed in her family home or in a room that had been prepared for her. She was in charge of her home and the land, and these roles were much more important in Sparta than in other Greek states. Spartan men spent most of their lives training for war or fighting in it. So Spartan women were responsible for running estates, supervising the estate workers, and making sure the household prospered. In many ways, a wife was the true economic backbone of the family, while her husband continued his service to the country. Visits between prisoners were often secret. A young husband might go out at night to meet his wife in secret and then go back to his barracks before sunrise. These secret meetings made married life feel very intense. Some historians think that this secrecy made desire last, because it meant that the passion didn't become less strong over time. Others think that this shows that men were more loyal to their friends in the army than to their wives. For the bride, this arrangement could make her feel both strong and alone. On one hand, she was given a level of authority that was unusual for women in other parts of Greece. Athenian wives lived a private life, but Spartan women were in charge of their husbands' money and made decisions for them when they were not around. On the other hand, the emotional distance created by the husband's absence meant that the marriage was more practical than loving. The most important thing was the children. When a couple had a healthy son, they had done what Sparta wanted. Daughters were also important because they would grow up to be strong Spartan mothers in the future. The family's success was measured not in romance, but in how many soldiers they provided for the state. So, life after the wedding night was full of contradictions. Spartan marriages were very strict, even cold by today's standards. But they did give women some unusual power and independence. They were unions that were formed to help them survive, not for companionship. These were partnerships that were created to help a city where war was always the most important thing. In ancient Greece, women's lives were mostly spent at home, and they weren't involved in politics or the economy. Sparta was very different. Spartan women were powerful, and getting married only made them more so. They weren't just passive bystanders. They played an active role in the state's survival. The most important role for a Spartan wife was to be a mother, but not just in the sense of having children. She was expected to have strong, healthy children who would grow up to be warriors or mothers of warriors. To achieve this, Spartan girls were raised in a way that shocked other Greeks. They trained physically from a young age. They ran, wrestled, and threw javelins. Their bodies got hard not for fighting, but for giving birth. The perfect Spartan woman was strong, brave, and not scared. Marriage built on this foundation, turning her from daughter into someone who would be responsible for the city's future. But her responsibilities were not just about looking after the baby, because husbands were tied to barracks until 30, and even afterwards, often away on campaign, wives became the heads of households. They were in charge of estates, supervised helots, enslaved laborers, who worked on Spartan farms and dealt with economic matters. The Spartan wife was in charge of her husband's money and property, and the Athenian wife would have found it hard to imagine doing the same. In fact, some say that women in Sparta eventually owned almost a fifth of the land, which is a huge amount for those times when men were in charge. They also had an influence on society and culture. Spartan mothers were famously bold, known for saying things that summed up the city's spirit. They told their sons heading to war to return with their shield or on it. This direct encouragement to accept victory or death was similar to the strong beliefs that marriage required. They are strong, they do their duty, and they sacrifice a lot for the country. Marriage did not make women less independent. It made it seem bigger than it was. Although Spartan wives had to follow strict rules, they still had a lot of influence in their families and communities. People respected and even feared them because they had very sharp tongues and were very strict. Men might have been the ones fighting in the war, but it was the women who made sure that Sparta's warrior society kept going strong at home. This makes the role of women in Spartan marriage seem strange. They did what the state wanted, but they had more power than most women in Greece. In Sparta, women were closely connected to the city's military life, but this also gave them the strength and freedom to have an impact on its future. In Sparta, people didn't decide if a couple was right for each other based on how much they liked each other, how much money they had, or how important their family was. Its true measure was children. The state expected every union to provide it with the most important resource of all, a steady supply of strong, disciplined citizens to sustain the Spartan military. The next generation was not just a private family matter. It was something the community felt they had to do, and they would always be watching to make sure it was done properly. From the moment of marriage, couples were under pressure to have children quickly. Sons were especially important because they would one day join the Aeog and become warriors. But daughters were not seen as a problem. Women who were strong were seen as the future mothers of warriors. Actually, Spartan girls were raised with just as much focus on their physical health as boys. This was to make sure they could have children and give birth to healthy babies. The focus on strength led to some unusual practices. If a husband was too old or unable to have children, the state might encourage his wife to have a child with a younger or stronger man. This was not considered to be as bad as other things that happened in Greek cities. It was practical. The goal was to make sure that no womb was wasted and that every marriage produced children who would serve Sparta. Some people even say that men might let their wives have sex with very strong warriors to have better babies, like how animals are trained to do something. Newborns were closely examined after being born. Elders checked the babies to make sure they were healthy and strong enough to survive. Sparta was a very strong society. They believed that weak or deformed babies were not valuable, and so sometimes these babies were left alone to die. For those who were considered fit, childhood was short. Boys were soon taken from their mothers to begin training in the Aeog. Mothers, though very close to their children, were expected to accept this as part of their role. At that time, marriage was closely linked to the state's plans to improve the quality of its population through selective breeding. Couples were not just starting families. They were producing soldiers and mothers, the raw material of Sparta's future. Even intimacy itself was secondary to this aim. The rituals, secrecy, and discipline surrounding Spartan marriage were all about one thing: a next generation that can keep the city going. For Spartans, love was short-lived, but their legacy lasted. A successful marriage was one that made Sparta stronger, not just the husband and wife happier. In most Greek city-states, marriage was a private matter between families. In Sparta, however, the state was very much a part of every union and used it to further its military goals. Marriage was not a contract of love or property. It was a way of managing the city and it was strictly controlled to make sure the city could survive. The state decided when people could get married. Men weren't allowed to get married until they'd finished years of military training and turned 30. This made sure that only the most experienced and trustworthy warriors were given the responsibility of protecting families. Women, on the other hand, were married young. This was because having children was seen as something that would help the city early on. Even the idea of older men being with younger women was less about tradition and more about strategy. This meant that the chances of the baby having strong offspring were increased. As well as the timing, the state also got involved in fertility itself. If a marriage didn't have children, it wasn't seen as a personal problem, but as a public failure. The state could encourage unusual arrangements that allow a man to have children with a woman or an older husband to lend his wife to a younger warrior. The Spartans didn't see this as shameful. They saw it as practical. Every couple had to help make more Spartan warriors. Even the traditions of marriage were influenced by the ideas of the state, like shaving the bride's head, the ritual abduction, and keeping meetings between spouses a secret. These customs showed that people should be careful with money and disciplined. The government wanted its citizens to have these qualities. Marriage was another form of training, not a way to escape it. The state was always present, which made the paradox of Spartan life even stronger. While men were obliged to stay in the barracks, women were given unusual authority in their homes. By making men stay in the army even after they got married, the government made it possible for their wives to run the estates and have an influence. This made it so that the state had more control over marriage, which made women more powerful in their families and in the economy. In Sparta, marriage was not a personal achievement, but a civic obligation. Every shaved head, every secret meeting, every child born under its system was proof that the state was involved in every part of people's lives. In Sparta, even love and family had to give way to the needs of war. The marriage customs of Sparta, which seem strange and severe to us today, were never just personal traditions. They were a reflection of a society based on discipline, frugality, and service to the state. In Sparta, weddings were not like in Athens, where they were colorful celebrations with music and food. In Sparta, weddings were marked by shaved heads, staged abductions, and secrecy. These practices took away the romance and luxury from marriage, turning it into a way of making good citizens. The reason we still remember these customs is because they perfectly showed what was important to the people of Sparta. Every part of the wedding ceremony was a symbol of unity, strength, and submission. For example, the bride's transformation into a man's attire and the groom's nightly visits from a barracks. In the past, marriage was not about having fun. It was about doing a job. It was designed to create a partnership that was like Sparta's military order, strong, efficient, and focused on survival. But, strangely, this system made women more important than in other parts of Greece. Because men were still obliged to serve in the military, women took on roles as estate managers, property holders, and household guardians. Spartan wives were young, but they had a lot of influence. They were confident and independent. While the state imposed strict controls, it also made women very prominent in civic life, a legacy that fascinated and unsettled other Greeks. These customs also show that Sparta had a very strict view of human relationships. Children were checked for strength. Marriages were arranged to help with fertility, and even intimacy was subject to the demands of the state. Love was less important than duty, and beauty was less important than strength. What mattered was not the comfort of husband and wife, but the endurance of a society that was always at war. When Sparta eventually declined, its marriage rituals, like its military discipline, became the stuff of legend. Writers from other Greek cities often described them as strange and even cruel, but also admirable because of their strong commitment. Today, they show us how important a culture's values are for its most personal institutions. The Spartan tradition of marriage is not about romance, but about revealing something about a person's true self. They show us what happens when the government gets involved in family life, changing love and marriage into ways of surviving. In Sparta, even weddings were seen as battles, where duty was more important than love, and the future of the city was decided by the strong connections between husbands and wives.